Hey there, this is Taylor Ellwood, and welcome to the latest pop culture magic video that I'm going to do here. If you're new to this channel, go ahead and click subscribe, and then go ahead and click the bell notification. And if you're a frequent flyer here, feel free to leave a comment and tell us what you think. So today I am asking the question, can pop culture spirits die? And by extension, I think I'm really asking the question, can spirits die? Now, just going to put a spoiler alert here. If you haven't seen the latest James Bond movie and you don't want to know what happens, then stop watching right now and come back to this video later. All right. That said, I'm going to talk about can pop culture spirits die? So I went recently to see No Time to Die, which was the latest James Bond movie. I've been watching James Bond movies since before I was a teenager. My dad loved them. And I pretty much have seen every single one since that time. So since like the Sean Connery days, to give you guys an idea. And I don't know if I was ever a huge fan. I mean, I liked them, I grew up with them. So kind of like I like them in that sense. But, we can comment on my dad and his lack of awareness around appropriate TV or movie viewing another time. But what I will say is that what always stood out to me about the whole James Bond thing is that, James Bond was immortal. He never died. Well, in No Time to Die, he finally dies. The latest version of James Bond dies. And it brings up a really interesting question. Can a pop culture spirit die? Well, if we look at not just movies, like a TV shows, books, or any other form of media where there's pop culture characters do die all the time. If you've ever read the Dragonlance series, the Knight Sturm dies, by the end of the second book. The character Raistlin ends up dying at a much later time, in the series. Different characters will die at different points. Now, what's interesting is that some of those characters still end up becoming timeless. Like Raistlin dies, but then he comes back from the dead a couple different times. So, he's kind of timeless. There's other characters, though, that like in the case of Sturm, he stays dead. If we look at James Bond is kind of timeless. There's multiple versions of James Bond. So one version of James Bond died, but that doesn't mean that the core archetype of James Bond has died. It just means that particular version of James Bond has died. And we could argue, reasonably so, that you could still work with that version of James Bond. I mean, watch the movie Skyfall. That version of James Bond is still alive by the end of that movie. Watch one of the other movies that features him, and he's still alive. So James Bond is always going to some degree or another, be alive. But there's an interesting caveat to this. I think where pop culture spirits and really spirits in general can die, or at least to fade away into oblivion, and this will seem somewhat heretical and blasphemous to some people, is when spirits are no longer relevant to people, when they cease being important. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's say one day nobody watches James Bond or knows who James Bond is or what James Bond is. Then James Bond becomes irrelevant. That pop culture spirit of James Bond at that point will die. There is no relevance, or at least that spirit will fade away to oblivion because there's no relevance keeping that spirit around. What is an interesting thing about spirit work in general, and I think this is something that a lot of people gloss over or ignore, is that really spirits rely upon us to exist. If I'm alive and I believe in a spirit, then that gives that spirit a lifeline. But if I'm gone and nobody else believes in that spirit, then that spirit may still exist. But until that spirit finds some means of connecting with people, it's going to become less and less relevant. And spirits thrive on relevance. They thrive on being something to someone. Now, again, this is going to upset some of the more traditional people who will say, well, I believe in these spirits and I worship them, et cetera, and what you're saying is blasphemous and wrong. Well, Is it? I mean, honestly, a good question to ask ourselves is why do spirits, and I mean older spirits, why do they find a way to inject themselves into modern culture? And what do I mean by that? Well, look at the Norse gods. They're definitely well and present in the Marvel series, right? The Marvel movies, the comic books. They're well and present in the show Vikings. They're well and present in other forms of media. Look at the Greek gods, same thing. Now, those two particular pantheons are really good at injecting themselves into modern culture and staying relevant. There are other pantheons which aren't as good at it. That doesn't mean they're not still around, but they have less power. They have less significance. They may have power and significance to some people, and these people would say, well, how dare you diminish my gods? These gods have been around for a long time, blah, 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 blah. They've been around longer than you, Taylor. And my answer to that would be, well, sure. They've been around longer than I am, and they very well they very well likely will be around after I'm gone. But if no one believes in them, they don't have any relevance. And if you don't have relevance, then it doesn't matter if you continue to exist. And all those godlike powers you have don't matter either if there's no one there to appreciate them. There's a reason that spirits are drawn to us. There's a number of reasons, actually. But one of the most significant reasons is because the spirits get benefits from connecting with us. We give them something they would not get otherwise, right? And I know a lot of people would say, but Taylor, you're diminishing the importance of the spirits. And it's like, well, no, I'm not. I'm what I'm doing is I'm getting us to examine the spirits from a place of equilibrium. What does it really look like to work with spirits, right? Whether it's a pop culture spirit or an older spirit, we always have to look at how the spirits are benefiting from working with us as well as how we're benefiting. Are we getting access to specific things of knowledge? Are they perhaps working a miracle for us? Are they doing something else? Sure, let's acknowledge that. No problem with that. But let's also acknowledge that they're getting something out of the equation. What they get out of the equation may not be something we fully understand. We can acknowledge that and say, yeah, we're making a presumption that, for example, that the attention and worship we give them is something that they need for reasons that involve them being able to feed off of that energy. I mean, that could be true, but do we know that for sure? Not necessarily. We're making an educated guess based on our experiences. So, and we're also framing it within the context of a human perspective. And that's always something to note, because the human perspective is always going to frame things from the context of being a human. So I have no problem acknowledging that, and I think it should be acknowledged. But what I have a problem with is when people treat spirits as sacrosanct and never question the relationship. Or when they treat spirits like lowly minions and servants and never question the relationship. I mean, I think really, regardless of which extreme you take, and they are both extremes, then you have to really question, well, what's the dynamic there? Like, why do some people, for example, insist on becoming God slaves and treat gods as better than them? I mean, there's a self-esteem issue there, I could say. But there's probably also, more importantly, it's just the specific framework that they're working in. Fair enough. But why? And why don't they question that framework? At the same time, why don't we question the framework of like the grimoire model? I'm going to summon up a spirit and smack them around and force them to do something. Why do we insist on investing in that equilibrium? And by the same token, someone could say to me, well, Taylor, why do you insist on approaching spirits from a place of equity, from a place of collaboration? And I would say in response, I've gotten more out of that approach to spirit work than I've ever gotten from the other two models. And they could say the same thing to me. Fair enough. We ought to question why any person, myself included, approaches spirit work in a given way. But this goes back to this question of can spirits die, which I framed around the question of can pop culture spirits die, right? Well, pop culture spirits can die because pop culture spirits, um, inevitably go out of existence. They're no longer part of the canon. But are they really dead? They're dead in the books. They're dead in the movies. But that doesn't mean that they're really dead. They can still be worked with. They only become dead when they're no longer relevant. Someday, some pop culture will end up going away. I mean, a lot of pop culture has gone away over the years. Some pop culture manages to linger on. And you kind of have to look at like what makes that pop culture linger on, what's successful about it. And it really just depends. Part of it is the attention that's going toward a given pop culture. Let's use Marilyn Monroe as an example. Okay, she's the actress. From like the 1950s and 60s. She made some really good movies, and people liked her acting and stuff. But she became an icon back then. Is she still an icon now? Well, maybe yes, maybe no. I mean, she is to some degree. She certainly has a sense of timelessness about her. But, if you were to ask somebody that's probably in their late teens or early 20s who Marilyn Monroe is, they may or may not know who that is. It may not be as relevant. There's a certain timeline. And the successful pop culture spirit is the pop culture spirit that manages to continually reinvent themselves in some form or manner, or continually finds a way to be referenced in some form or manner in order to continue existing. In a very real sense, we could look at pop culture spirits, and really spirits in general, from the viral model of magic, where a spirit is basically a virus, and it propagates itself by continuing to exist in the overall structure of the thing. I'm going to see if I can. Oh, that gives me way too much light. Sorry, guys, if I blinded you. And that gives me a little bit less light. It's just the nature of the window here. Anyway, spirits can. We could argue that a spirit has the viral model, where the spirit propagates itself as a virus, continually, or a symbiotic virus anyway. Like it has some benefits it gives us, but it's continuing to propagate itself. And the most successful ones are the ones who show up not just within the traditional culture that they're from, but show up in modern culture as well. I use the Greek gods as an example because it's a perfect one. If you look at the Greek gods, like whether they show up in some type of TV show, like Son of Zeus was one that recently came out on Netflix, like about a half a year back. This is anime. That's a good example. Or if they show up in like a video game series like God of War, something along those lines, that's what keeps them relevant. Now, the version of them may be a bit different from the classical version, but that doesn't mean really anything. That just means that they're using that versioning to be smart and savvy enough to stay relevant to people. And versioning in pop culture is totally a thing. I mean, you have different versions of James Bond, as I referred to. You have different versions of, the Joker and Batman. At some point, there will be a different version of Harry Potter if the author and the people making those things plays it smart. At some point, we will probably see a brand new retelling of the 7 Harry Potter films with new actors and everything else, because, if they want to stay timeless. I mean, look at Dune right now. There's been like 3 different versions of the movie Dune and a miniseries. The latest version is probably the best one. I've seen the other ones, and they're pretty cheesy. This one actually doesn't seem too bad. But it's like it's a fascinating thing where this pop culture reinvents itself and stays relevant in the minds of people, and these spirits kind of take on this very godlike role where they are continually propagating themselves through the consciousness of people. And this is part of what I'm talking about when we look at pop culture magic and really just spirits in general. So can spirits die? Yes. Do they die? Not necessarily. And if they do die, it's because they've lost relevance. They've lost the ability to propagate and be a virus. Again, some people are going to find this blasphemous and heretical, and that's okay. I'm not here to make everyone happy. I'm sharing this with you as a different vein of thought, something to consider, a way of looking at spirit work that'll make you go, makes you go, Right, there's a little pop culture for you, if you get that reference. But seriously, think it over, and feel free to comment on this video if you found it helpful and valuable. I just wanted to share some interesting thoughts that came to mind after having seen the James Bond movie recently.